Imagine a museum of the future, made up entirely of the stories we tell each other. Not the history that is captured in textbooks, but in the voices of the people who lived it. Which stories would resonate with you? Which ones do you think will last? And which will go on to shape how we live our lives now and in the future? Welcome to Artifactuality, a podcast series featuring remarkable stories generously shared with the Canadian Museum of History. I'm your host, Kim Thuy. On this episode of Artifactuality, we have always been here.
I always say no matter where you go, where it's uncultivated or natural areas, you're going to find evidence of our people there. And then that's where the importance of learning our stories, our origin stories, working with archaeologists to kind of help give an idea of how old our stories, our songs, and our ceremonies are.
In the southwest corner of Alberta, there's a special place called Wallis Beach.
So look at that. That's a really interesting one.
Another one.
It's a breathtaking spot, nestled where the prairies and the Rocky Mountains meet. In the heartland of the Blackfoot Nations, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani.
It's a nice windy day.
Nice windy day.
Temperature about 26, 27 degrees.
It's a beautiful day for September.
The beach is former farmland just across the St. Mary's Reservoir from the reserve of the Kainai Nation. 70 years ago, the St. Mary River was dammed, flooding farmland and reserve land alike. Now, periods of low water leave parts of the reservoir bed exposed to wind and waves. Erosion has revealed the footprints of woolly mammoths that once crossed mudflats here at the end of the last ice age. And other species too, like extinct forms of muskox, camel, horse, and bison, have all been identified from their bones.
We found 5,000-6,000-year-old jackrabbit bones right embedded in the caliche crust in places. So this here, good spot to look, because this should contain old material.
And those square units that they excavate,
Yep.
this is what they kind of look at, like a profile.
Exactly.
This area was once the ice-free corridor, which emerged as continental ice sheets over the Rocky Mountains and prairies began to melt. Stone tools scattered across the surface of Wallis Beach tell a remarkable story, from ancestral Blackfoot contact with Europeans a few short centuries ago and butchered horse and camel bones that are more than 13,000 years old. The role of the ice-free corridor in the human history of the Americas has long been debated by Western scientists. But for the Blackfoot peoples of southern Alberta and Montana, there is no doubt. Their stories, songs, and ceremonies teach that they have always been here. It was once rare for archaeologists to give equal consideration to indigenous interpretations when piecing together the past.
It's September 11th, 2022. I'm out at Wallis Beach today.
But that's all changing.
And the reservoir level is about 4 meters higher than it needs to be for me to get out to the exposed parts of Wallis Beach on the St. Mary Reservoir.
Gabrielle Janicki is the curator of Western archaeology at the Canadian Museum of History.
But today the water level is covering pretty much the entire site except for an island that stayed clear of the level of the reservoir this whole time since the dam was built in the 1950s.
Janicki has been reaching out to Blackfoot elders, recognizing that their philosophies and stories are essential to understanding the history of the land and its people. After all, the Blackfoot peoples have inhabited the northern plains, an area that includes parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana, since time immemorial.
You can see it's quartzite, quite dense rock, doesn't explode when it's heated up.
That's the same kind of rocks we use in our sweats too, right?
Exactly, yeah.
That's Piikani elder Jerry Potts. He, along with his wife, Velma Crowshoe, and Siksika traditional knowledge expert Ken Youngman, recently met up with Yaniki at Wallis Beach. They talked about the importance of this area from both an archaeological perspective and a traditional Blackfoot one.
This is probably one of so many sites that haven't even that haven't even been discovered.
Yeah.
That all represent timelines, but yet it still goes back to the original inhabitants of the area. Like we're the host of the feast with the story that's being told.
Before, during, and after a dig, archaeologists like Yaniki seek opportunities for collaboration with indigenous peoples. It's part of an ongoing effort to decolonize the very process of archaeology itself. Elder Jerry Potts explains how this has helped reaffirm ancestral Blackfoot ties to the land as established in oral histories.
I think we're at a time right now where, archaeology has become so effective, like even in BC, because it's unceded land. And they've been very bright on how they've used archaeology to determine their sites. In Montana, the same thing. These different tribes that have claimed areas, they've brought in archaeology and done archaeological digs that have proven they are Blackfoot sites. It's just endless where the mind can go with what's there that hasn't been discovered.
Kent, a young man, speaks about bringing the two knowledge traditions together.
And that's where the importance of learning our stories, our origin stories, right? Working with archaeologists to kind of help give an idea of how old our stories, our songs, and our ceremonies are.
He explains the creation stories were not just passed down orally. They were depicted in detail on teepees and in Blackfoot art.
That relationship, that kinship that our people have with animals, the birds, all of creation, like our homes. You look at our homes, all the different drawings on our homes, our teepee designs. They're right from climate, the stars, animal, people, earth, water, everything are on our homes. And right there, that just shows our connection to this vast place.
That connection remained unbroken in spite of the fatal disruption by residential schools when entire generations were removed from this crucial storytelling chain.
My mom, when she was a kid, before she got taken to residential school, her grandmother, her name was Mary Waterchief. In the winter time, they moved down to North Camp. I come from the west end of the reserve, and that's where my grandfather, that's where he farmed and ranched. Winter time, the people congregated down to a place where we call North Camp, and they lived with the old lady. She had a house down there. And my mom would say, we always used to fight to sleep with the old lady because she would tell, she would tell the stories from the ancient times. So that's the interpretation I'll use, our stories, our ancient stories. And she always said, I remember her talk about two stories, Suatsaki, Wakski, and Itskitex. Suatsaki is that Scarface story. Mm-hmm. And then Itskitex, it's a story about when these big animals brought these kids across a big water. How the old lady described it was a woolly mammoth. It was big like an elephant, had a trunk and tusks. And those kids got left and their people were on the other side of this big water. And they're on the back of that animal and they're picking the bugs off the fur. And that animal told them, well, for relieving me if those bugs were bothering me for a long time, I'll do what you guys want me to do. And well, I wanted to go to our family on that side. So that animal brought those kids across the water to their people. You know, it's a big, long story, but my mom grew up, before she was taken to the residential school, that all that stuff was severed. But, you know, talking about this area of the relationship with woolly mammoth and such, you know, it solidifies our stories, our ceremonies, our songs, our language. That's what I always talk about. That's why I appreciate the relationships that I've built with archaeologists, anthropologists. It's a neat relationship with the ceremonial people of the Blackfoot. It's neat to hear these stories from a lot of different people.
Yeah.
Some will talk about it this way, and then another person will talk about it. And there's something that may have been missed by these people. When you put them all together, it's the same story.
Yeah.
It is the same story, repeated time and time again by the Blackfoot peoples and their ancestors, and that's increasingly apparent to archaeologists. As for when this history began, that's a question that preoccupies many Western scientists. But in Blackfoot storytelling and its worldview, the very concept of time is reckoned with differently.
Very interesting to talk about notions of time, because time is such an important referent in Western thought.
This is Dr. Leroy Littlebear, the Vice Provost at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. He is also a renowned Kainai legal scholar and philosopher, and an expert at understanding the concept of time in Blackfoot culture.
This is not to say that time is not important in Blackfoot, but a very different approach. The Western notion of time is really human created, when in reality, there's really no such thing. But nevertheless, the notion in Western thought about time is a very linear notion, where you go from A to B to C to D on down the line. Now, in Blackfoot thought, it's really the notion of repetition and things occurring, reoccurring, and so on. So you start to have notions about circles and so on, because repetition can easily complement the notion of rotation, etc. And that is, in Blackfoot, we say anhok, meaning now. It's the now. And then you can work forward and say apinakosi, and that's tomorrow. And then you can move from there and say Mr. Papinakosi, which is day after tomorrow. And if you want to put it that way, you could say matuni, yesterday, Mr. Putuni, which is the day before yesterday. But then we don't go beyond that. At that level, we don't go beyond that. In very general terms, we might talk about isochik. In other words, what's going to be coming. In other words, we're going to call it future isochik. And we might talk about the past as, but that's in very general terms, iskuchik means what has passed, iskuchik. And those words actually imply that there's something still, and you are going up and down the timeline, so to speak. Rather than you being still and time going past you in a Western notion, it implies that time is still and you're going back and forth on the timeline. So iskuchzik is kind of going back, and isuchzik means kind of going forward. And when I say that we don't go past the 2 days forward or backwards, what it's really doing is saying and combining all the notions of past, present, and future in Western thought. It's just past the 2-day period. It's combined, and that's what we would refer to as just is. It just is. Beyond the 2-day notion is everything, past, present, and future, are amalgamated to be just is. One of the ramifications of it is that, hey, that's how I remember what my ancestors told me. See, in other words, their stories are never more than 2 days old. They're always 2 days fresh in my mind. And so it's hard to think about it, especially for a judge in a court case trying to determine, when did this happen? 500 years ago? 1,000 years ago? And their question is usually, how can you remember what happened 1,000 years ago, let alone 20,000 years ago? Well, that's because my ancestors are just 2 days away. Their stories are 2 days fresh in my mind. See?
So one question I have then is there a statute of limitations on how far back this repetition and the reckoning of time and the memory of events can go?
Gabriel Janicki again.
When we talk about sites like Wally's Beach as an archaeologist, are Blackfoot stories potentially encapsulating that time period and further back?
Well, the thing is, those are basically, I would say, reference points that we use in human thoughts. Okay, so how do we go back? Well, we go back and we say, well, there was a time when there was just all those animals, and then in the cosmic phasing, things did change and we appeared, but then we were just like little kids, new kids on the block with all these others, and we had to start seeing what kind of relational setups we can have with them, see. So that's the reason why we have great respect for life and so on. So we start to appear on the scene. So talking about Wally's Beach, hey, yeah, we would just say, hey, somewhere a long time ago, which is in that realm of just is. See, and any stories that arise from there are part of the repetitive storytelling that occurs and so on. So the buffalo, as an example, was a water being. We call it water buffalo. He knew it was water buffalo. It used to come out of the water and it would hunt anything it sees, including humans. And eventually, in those stories, was the humans and the buffaloes finally decided to talk and have an agreement. Hey, we don't want you chasing and eating our people and so on. And the buffaloes agreed, okay, but if we're going to do that, the agreement, well, then You give us half of your people, and we'll give you half of our people. See? And so they agreed to that. And so that's what has produced a buffalo out on the land, which was originally water. They were water beings. And in our case, the humans kind of thought about it a little bit and were a little bit reluctant about letting half of their people to go into the water to give them to the buffalo. But it so happened they were moving camp and going across a big river or lake or so, and they were going across, and it was during the winter, and the water, the ice broke, and half of them went into the water. And so de facto, the quid pro quo did occur. So it's part of that flux. It's part of that flux way of thinking as opposed to more stagnant notion. So that's how that notion, which might be going back to Wally's Beach, hey, 20,000 years ago or so, well, that's how we remember it because of the repetition of the stories and how we came into being, how buffaloes came into being, and so on.
So whether we're talking about 20,000 years or 2 days ago, what has remained are the stories. Near Fort Macleod, Alberta, there's a place called Head Smash and Buffalo Jump. It was named after the practice of driving herds of buffalo over a cliff to their deaths, a communal hunting technique perfected over millennia by Blackfoot ancestors. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There, Gabrielle Janicki and the Blackfoot elders continued their conversation about the often difficult relationship between researchers and Indigenous peoples.
Thanks, Arun. So the first question that I'd set aside here to go over is whether you all think that archaeologists have historically done a good job of seeking input from Blackfoot peoples on research into their ancestral heritage.
Well, I think archaeology, this is Jerry Potts. I know archaeology has been, I think with probably more recently, there's been more outreach to the Blackfeet people within their territory. We're now in a position we're starting to understand and express who we are, and I think archaeology is given a good opportunity to put our cards on the table that represent who we are.
I realized the importance of archaeology was listening to some of our elders.
This is Piikani elder Velma Croshoe.
Like my dad, for instance, the late Johnny Olhorn, the stories that he used to tell and the songs that he used to sing and how they relate to the lands. And so I think it's really important that we listen to our traditional knowledge and we hear their stories and how we can put the archaeology to better our lives, for the young people, so they understand that we've been here for a long, long time. And the language too, the language is so important because there's a lot of words in our language that you can't even translate into English, And I think it's really important that we learn our creation stories so the young people can understand and to appreciate who we are and where we live.
I don't think archaeologists have historically done a good job on the work that goes behind the science of archaeology.
This is Kent, a young man again.
My involvement with working with archaeologists, they base everything off theories. And what I get a kick out of is sometimes these theories get debunked and they all come together and start to try to figure something out on somebody else's research, going way back. I think within the last few decades, archaeologists have finally been reaching out to Indian people and the studies that they do. And this land bridge is a good example of that.
The land bridge theory, which we mentioned earlier, is the idea that the first Ice Age humans arrived in North America from Asia by walking across a frozen path over the Bering Strait. Indigenous people have been widely skeptical about this theory because they have no stories of living in such a place.
I think archaeology, it's fairly new in North America. It's been going on for a long time outside of North America. So they came into this place trying to figure out these people. And the way I look at it, our people were once considered a dying race, and, with all the different adverse impacts that our people have endured. Our people lived in this place for a long time. And then that's always explained through our stories. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about today, is our connection to this place and how the government really tried to sever. And they did a good job. They did a good job. I know in my community, where I come from, Siksika, they did a good job on disconnecting our people to our ways of knowing. And our ways of knowing ties us to this place. Everything, how things came to be, is explained through how the old people told their stories to the grandchildren. And then as the grandchildren lived through their life, they start to learn more to these stories, which leads into our spiritual ways and our spiritual connection. Historically, I didn't think they were doing a good job, but the last few decades, it's been going a lot better than how it used to be done.
I think that this whole thing with the archaeological thing is going to take these people's modern day thinking and take it out of that time frame and put it to another time frame. Instead of thinking this way back, it'll change that thinking.
This is Jacob Potts, a Piikani ceremonialist.
Because a lot of modern day people think, oh yeah, well, we crossed over a land bridge and all this other thing. And a lot of people come and say, look, that's where we came from, Asia or Africa, and on that side of the world. And I think this ties us to us being here. And like everyone else said here, it connects us to this land and all of our creation stories stemming from here. And a lot of people, especially this day and age, have that thinking, oh yeah, well, you guys were never always here, eh? And that's what people are saying, but they have like almost no backing of that. And now this is just kind of reinforcing us always being here and coming from this land and us coming from here rather than, coming from somewhere other part of the world and coming from north to south, where to my knowledge is we were always here.
Well, as an archaeologist, that part of my life journey, I could say, has been very adversarial.
Stan Knowlton, also from the Piikani Nation, studied at the University of Lethbridge. He is a traditional knowledge expert. As a student, he was taught by largely white professors what they thought was the history of his people.
Professors had a hard time realizing that I was even in their class. They just couldn't figure out how this Stone Age person still existed in a modern world. And, from that point to where we are now, I could see that we've come a long way. Some people, just by getting up there and maintaining their stories and their culture and history, have broken the ice for the future generations. And they've opened up doors, and it's up to the younger people now to be able to make use of those doors that have opened and to take those next steps that are necessary into making archaeology more compatible with traditional knowledge.
And that change is happening, incorporating traditional knowledge into archaeological studies and practices. Kenta Youngman experienced it himself with the University of Calgary Field School.
One year, we started field season. And one of the folks from U of C got up to talk as we were doing the orientation and mentioned, sometimes we forget as archaeologists the history that we're digging, that we're finding. We don't realize that there's people still living here. I like his comment that when you're in your classes, your professors couldn't understand that there's a Stone Age person sitting in there.
It's always been convenient to go and get people to say what you want them to say without consulting other groups, other knowledge holders.
This is Elder Jerry Potts again.
And a lot of times we've been subjected to one person's opinion. But archaeology overall has been, there's been a lot of systemic racism by government and local groups not giving any respect to the people that have always been here. Our stories of creation go back to always being in this territory. And we were never transplanted or brought here. And I think through science and archaeology and the folks that know to get the missing answers are now reaching out to knowledge holders and that kind of a thing to get a better understanding of the past and, of who we are. And our stories have never changed. They're still the same.
Especially when it comes to creation stories. Every culture seems to have one.
With Blackfoot, with our belief system, every being, everything represents a life. Our stories of creation are connected to the sun and the moon. The earth is a living being, but it's not Mother Earth. And this Turtle Island bullshit too it's not Turtle Island, this is Blackfoot territory. And that's how it is. And you get all these academics, Turtle Island, and they get their dream voice on, and it's just.
That's going to be my favorite part of the podcast right here, Chair.
I'll stand by it.
I'll second that.
I'll take the shit for it, but I think that's the point. The point with that is every nation across this country, their belief system is tied to the geography and their territory that they're from. Everything we have comes from the landscape around us. That's our marker. And that's who makes the Blackfeet who they are, is the territory, our ceremonies, the songs that go with those ceremonies all come from animals. They come from when dogs could talk, when we were shown how to live with things. That's where all this stuff comes, and it's all here.
We're back at Wally's Beach, which took its name from a nearby recreational area, though exactly who it was named after is unclear. But like so many places, it bears the stamp of settler history without giving much thought to who has always been here.
And it's one of the things I'm hoping to get underway with this. Bringing everyone together is like, what should the name of the site be? It's not my place to name it, but I think it's overdue for a better name.
A better name to match a better way of working together, where the stories about a place and the people who live there tell us as much as science ever can. So what comes next at sites like Wally's Beach? Plans are taking shape to visit the site again and to collaborate on a new dig, continuing the work of interpreting its history through multiple voices and different perspectives. Thanks for listening to Artifactuality, a podcast of the Canadian Museum of History. I'm Kim Thuy. Artifactuality is produced by Makua Creative and Antica Productions. Tanya Talaga and Jordan Hoffman are the executive producers at Makua. Lisa Gabrielle is the producer, Andrea Varsany is the associate producer, and Sophie Dommett is the researcher for Antica. Laura Reguer and Stuart Cox are executive producers at Antica, mixing and sound design by Alain Derbez. Jenny Ellison and Robin Jeffrey of the Canadian Museum of History are the executive producers of this podcast. The interviews with the Blackfoot elders were conducted by Gabrielle Janicki, curator, Western Archaeology. Danielle Neal, researcher, sport and leisure, is the museum's podcast coordinator. Check out historymuseum.ca for more stories, articles, and exhibitions from the museum. For more information about Head Smashed Tin Buffalo Jump and Indigenous creation stories, check out the links in our show notes.